a lot of experts are of the view that we still have to maintain some level of moderate inflation, whether we all cry that we don't want rising prices of food and all of that. But can we say that if inflation, because we saw what the figure released by the NBS last month, inflation has dropped to 11%, up there about 11.1%. Do you think that...
What's core inflation?
Yes. Do you think that if we had gone
What's
ahead...
core inflation?
All right.
No. That was year on year.
Year on year.
Yeah, but what's the core inflation? That's what touches the common man. What rate is that? That's about 15%, 16%.
Now, the core inflation, but if you look at the other parts of the components, what make up, why are we having that on the high side, like you mentioned? We have food, rising price of food, the flooding in some parts of the country. But in all, would you have said that, or can we say that if the central bank was to go ahead with 5,000 naira note and inflation is to continue to drop, would that be a very good scenario to have such a high denomination printed?
Well, if you follow that line of argument, then why not, if you think 5,000 naira note will reduce the rate of inflation, then why don't you go straight and produce 100,000?
The central bank has said there is no link really between inflation and that figure.
Yeah,
right?
So exactly. So why if they have said that, then why should they suggest that higher denomination notes would reduce inflation? I mean, that's, so if they believe that, I mean, the sensible thing for them to do would be to print 100,000 naira notes so as to eradicate inflation. So basically, it is an insincere approach to problem solving. You cannot expect higher denomination notes to create inflation so long as the velocity of circulation remains the same. But if the velocity of circulation changes, either slows down or increases, then you are either likely to have reduced inflation or higher inflation, as the case may be. But if this velocity of circulation increases, which is likely to be the case with the introduction of a 5,000 naira note or a higher denomination note, because people who receive these notes, particularly, especially since they don't have control over what they are paid across the counter from the bank, what you would have is that there would be a higher velocity of circulation. In other words, as soon as you get your 5,000 naira note, you might just want to buy something. But if the thing is just 100 naira and they tell you you don't have any change, you might end up buying 200 naira and so on. But the most important thing is that the need to quickly unbundle this note, okay, would be repeated many times over. And together with the concept of the cash-light society, cash-light economy, which also increases the velocity of circulation, because you don't have to wait for long again before your checks are cleared. Your money is transferred within minutes, and all this increase the velocity of circulation. So together with the cashless society and a higher denomination note, of course you are going to expand money supply. There's no two ways about it. That's the reality. And central bank itself admits that when you expand money supply, inflation would arise. But the point I keep making is that this is a distraction. The real issue is, why is there permanent inflation in this country? I accept your point.
Let me take you back to when we had the 500 naira note, 1,000 naira note, and all that. What was the situation about, the economic situation at that point in time? I know that not much,
has changed
in terms of the outcry. The level of the outcry that we had in terms of the 5,000 naira note was not the same when we had 1,000 naira note, 500 naira notes printed a few years ago.
Possibly also because the CBN was probably hasty in their climb. Normally you have, in this kind of thing, 1, 2, 5, 10, So in other words, from 1,000. If they had gone to 2,000, I doubt whether a lot of people, they might have been, but probably no. But to jump from 1 to 5 was considered to be arbitrary and totally unnecessary. But let me tell you something. If, for example, the 5,000 naira note is not printed on this occasion, and government remains, how would I say it, apprehensive of printing in the next 5 years or something like that, Nigerians themselves, in the next 5 years, would beg that a 5,000 or 10,000 naira note be printed for a very simple reason. The simple reason is that inflation would have eaten out of the value, of the current value of the 1,000 naira note, which is the highest denomination. Inflation has eaten 10% annually out of the purchasing value of the 1,000 naira note from 2005 when it was created or introduced till now.
But according to report, when we have this 1,000 naira note printed a few years ago, inflation actually dropped.
I don't know about that.
So why should we have inflation rise?
That is what I'm telling you, that if you say inflation dropped, it then makes sense that you should go and print a 100,000 naira note to eradicate inflation. But you know that is nonsense. You know, you can't, you know, because the reality, of course, is that the inability of the central bank to tackle inflation and bring down cost of borrowing. A lot of people don't understand the implication of low rate of, look, low rate of inflation guarantees your pension. You are working for nothing if inflation is rising in your country at 10% annually, and you think you have an income. When you try to collect your pension in 10 years' time, inflation has chopped the whole thing. That's how serious it is. Inflation also creates instability and instigates what? Higher cost of borrowing. Higher cost of borrowing makes it impossible for new companies or even companies that are existing to expand their production at a profitable or cost-effective basis and be competitive vis-a-vis imported items. Some of the countries that we are importing from bring goods in from manufacturers who maybe they only pay 2% interest on the loans that they take to produce. Some of them even get, 0% interest just to be able to encourage export. So if you have a situation of that nature, how can you ever expect the Nigerian economy to grow? Look, the Nigerian economy for the last 10, 20 years, you can quote all kinds of indices, but I think the best marker that you can do is ask people generally, how do you feel now against 10 years ago? And a lot of people will confidently tell you that they were better off 10 years ago, usually because the money in their hands could buy more than before. That is the threat of inflation. Inflation is what got Zimbabwe to printing 1 billion Zimbabwe dollar note, and that could only exchange for $1. So, Bolaji, it is important that people understand the responsibility of the central bank as the galvanizer, as the agent or the engine of growth within the system. And we should ask them. So it baffles me when the National Assembly say, we would only look at their budget and we would only also make sure that they have, an executive chairman who is an external chairman. And all those, those are important, of course, but the most important function of the CBN is price stability. Banking regulation and supervision, yes, but price stability is most important. And for you to say the experts in central bank know all this, it is clear they don't, because if they do, they would have been able to bring inflation down to 1 to 3% and cost of borrowing.
Would you say, based on what is happening in the global economy scene, that if this economy is getting a reprieve in terms of growth, because we're seeing slowing growth in many countries of the world, do you think that could dovetail into our own economy and boost economic activities?
Well, to the extent that it will lead to greater consumption of our main export commodity, crude oil, yes, because it will bring in more dollar income. But surprisingly, Bolaji, and that's the tragic part of it, surprisingly, excuse me, the increase in dollar income is going to create problems for us. It always has, because the more dollars that we earn, the greater seem to be our problems. You might wonder how, but this is the truth. You would find, for example, at a time that we had so much dollar income of $60 billion worth of reserves in 2006, 2000, when we paid off the Paris Debt Club and London Debt Club and all that, we had never in the past had so much reserves, meaning that we earned so much income as a result of export of crude oil in substantial quantities and at reasonable prices that we had a huge surplus, okay? But compare that to a time that we had maybe a total of 4 billion reserves, for example, in 1996. And yet, what was the exchange rate of the Naira, for example? It was 80 Naira to 1. So how come? And that 4 billion reserves was only supposed to be 4 months imports cover. So how do you explain the situation where you have 60 billion reserves, you paid up all your debts, and yet that was the year in which you ended up as one of the poorest nations in the world?
Maybe you look at the fact that we do a lot of importation in the country, and the central bank had to use our reserve, in other words, to be able to support importers, because some of those who have to import into the country have to use dollars or other foreign currencies like the Chinese yuan that
I used a very significant phrase. I said the imports demand cover. Imports demand cover means the amount that you estimate, or the average amount that you would need to cover your imports on a monthly basis, okay? So that was why I said 4 billion reserves in 1996 provided us with imports cover, and that takes care of your need to be able to service our imports, okay? So we had 4 months imports cover. Now, in 2007, 2006, we had 60 billion reserves. We were told that this would cover us, imports cover, for 40 months. Then suddenly we have our exchange rate even worse off than what it was before. We have interest rates rising to 20-something%. That shows that fundamentally something is wrong. And you should ask, what is the fundamental thing that continues to drive interest rate, that continues to drive inflation, that continues to drive excess liquidity? Because at the end of the day, it is the excess liquidity, too much money in the system. You might wonder, how can anyone say there's too much money in the system when the industries and everybody say there is no money?
Okay.
That is a contradiction.